All right, gentlemen, welcome to our second video. This video is going to cover content about Vatican II. This is one of the most important and most recent councils of the Church, and it's going to lead us into our modern understanding of what the Church is, how the Church interacts with the world, and in many ways, Vatican II addresses a lot of the different episodes that we've seen take place in the Church's history in an attempt to, to take an honest look at itself as a body, as a religious institution, as a teaching body, as the faithful disciples of Jesus, and say, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? How do we get the Church ready for the modern world and all of the challenges that the modern world are going to have? Normally when I teach this, we would spend a little bit of time talking about movements that go on between where we left off in Rerum Novarum in the 1890s. So this is where we were last time. And then where we're going to land, which is in the 1960s. Okay? So there's quite a lot of movement that takes place between the Industrial Revolution and the 1960s, right? World War I, World War II. The theory of evolution first comes around. Evangelicalism takes on a new, especially in the United States, it takes on a new role and vibrance in the community, and there's sort of this revivalist movement going on. In the the A-bomb, the dropping of the A-bomb, right, completely changing the way that we think about humanity, right? Now, humanity is able to push a button and kill and destroy itself completely. This is new. This causes a deep psychological and spiritual disruption for people. All of these changes that are happening pretty rapidly. And so the Church, which has remained pretty much constant since the Council of Trent, decides, it's time to open the windows, unseal the stained glass windows that were kind of keeping the Church buttressed in against the world, and open the doors and let some fresh air in and look at the Church in this new light. And so Pope John the 23rd, not to be confused with the false Pope John the 23rd that happened all the way back in the schism, the papal schism. He was an anti-pope, so he doesn't count. So this pope takes on the name John, and he's the 23rd because the other 23rd didn't count. Pope John the 23rd begins the Second Vatican Council actually in 1959, right before the 60s start. And the purpose, the goal, is to update the Church in order to minister effectively in our new times. This is the 20th Council of the Church. An ecumenical council is the calling together of the whole Church. And what Pope John the 23rd is looking for here is something called aggiornamento, which means to make things ready for today. It's an Italian phrase. And so the idea is, how do we modernize the Church while keeping it authentic to its true heritage as the body of Christ? This council is super cool. It is way cooler than any of the other councils that we've talked about so far. In my opinion, because this involves 2,500 bishops from around the world. It's the first time that we have bishops who are native to the places that they're representing, right? So we had Christianity that spread, say, to the United States, right? And it was European priests and bishops teaching native people, right? Or in South America, or in Africa, or in other places around the world. Second Vatican Council is the first time we actually have people who are native to those areas who have become bishops. So an Asian bishop representing Asia, an African bishop representing Africa, a Mexican bishop representing Mexico. All of the bishops from around the world are brought together. And in many ways, this is unprecedented in what the world is. Like, it's funny that we don't study Vatican II in our history textbooks because this is historical. This is a summit of world religious leaders coming together to talk about how to live faith and how to address, like, in the wake of these spiritual crises of World War I, World War II, the A-bomb, all of this crazy change. and new technologies, and television is coming out, and radio, and all of this. This is a momentous moment in this history. And in addition to these bishops from all around the world, women are invited to this council, which, I mean, granted, there's only 15 women, but hey, compared to the Council of Trent or the history of the church, usually reserving the male voice to be the one that's brought to bear on these conversations, this is beautiful, that the women are invited to at least participate as listeners. Observers from other faiths, Protestants are invited, Eastern Orthodox are invited, people from non-Christian faiths are invited to this council. So I love this. This gets me excited and hopeful that this is a sign of what the church can be, this beacon, this local gathering point where we can come together as a human race and look at what it means to live faithfully. So that's my pitch for why Vatican II is awesome. And the themes that Vatican II covers, these are some important things to think about because they result in what is familiar in the church today. So it was always permitted for Mass to be celebrated or Bibles to be read in languages other than Latin. That's a common myth, that Latin was the only thing that was allowed. There are rites in the native languages that have existed since before Vatican II. But in Vatican II, it was formally declared that Latin now is a dead language. It's no longer something that anybody natively speaks. And even though people have studied it and people in the church use it to write official documents, nobody around the world understands what's happening at Mass because it's not in their native language, it's in Latin. And so the vernacular, which is just a word that means local language, so the vernacular language, the language of the people in France, the language of the people in the U.S., the language of that is now promoted as a new form of the Mass, that the Mass can be said in that native language. And the idea is we want the people who are sitting in the pews to be active participants in the Mass, not just passive watchers of a sacred ritual. And believe me, I've been to a couple Latin Masses. There's something majestic and beautiful and otherworldly about the mystery of hearing it in Latin and not fully understanding everything. But the church is trying to demystify and make itself accessible to the common person. That's one of the themes of Vatican II, and it's one of the things that emerges. If you look in the photo on the right here, you can see lots of different changes that are represented here. First of all, the world was in black and white before Vatican II, and so Vatican II is the first time where color is introduced into the... No, I'm just kidding. But you can see the priest has his back to the congregation in this black and white photo. They're all celebrating together. They're all worshiping toward the cross. They're all behind the altar, and the priest is representing the sacrifice on the altar, which is supposed to be the cross. That changes into this almost more meal-like format, where the priest is on the other side of the table, and we're gathered around the table. The priest is facing us, much like Christ was probably facing his apostles at the Last Supper. So, I mean, again, there's beauty in both models. One is not morally right, and the other is morally wrong. But the Church in Vatican II is trying to open up and welcome and embrace. And so there are these stylistic changes that reflect that mission. There's also an emphasis in Vatican II to a universal call to holiness. That means all people are called to holiness, whether you're a priest or, a corporate executive or a president or a nurse or a firefighter or an Indian chief, whatever you are, we're all called to be holy. And I think that this is an important thing that's still filtering into our culture today. We think of being holy as something that's reserved for nuns and priests, and But if you want to get to heaven at the end of your life, then you're called to be a saint, because the people who are in heaven are saints, and you can't get to heaven without being a saint. And so the universal call to holiness is a reminder that you don't have to have a priest collar in order to be holy. You don't have to, that you're called in your ordinary life, or as Zavarian says, in the common, ordinary, unspectacular flow of daily life, to be holy. an emphasis on reading the Bible. It was observed that Protestants, and oftentimes this is still the case even today, are usually much better at knowing their Bible than Catholics. Catholics hear the Bible at Mass, but there's not necessarily as much Bible study and readings and things like that going on, particularly in a pre-Vatican II world. So you have Protestants who know their Bible inside and out, especially because of sola scriptura, right? It's the only source of authority for them, so they know it very well. Catholics should know it too, so there's an emphasis on that. An emphasis on religious freedom, and guys, this is one of the most beautiful things to come out of Vatican II, all right? Think about it. This is the Church, and the Church has historically tried to condemn heresy and control it, and control it by stopping it from spreading. And sometimes that involved burning texts or restricting texts, saying that they couldn't be read. It involved putting people to death. It involved war. Okay, and these wars weren't being fought like the Catholic Church is the aggressor all the time. Even the Crusades, as we talked about before, were provoked. At least the first was provoked. The wars of religion in Europe, Protestants versus Catholics, those wars were two-sided, kings from different regions, sometimes Catholic kings, sometimes Protestant kings, instigating. But in Vatican II, this same body, again, representing the broken humanity of the world, not just the Church, is coming to the realization that there are other ways to resolve these problems. And that Christ's approach with people was always to allow them to be free. He invited them into a relationship of love, not a relationship of fear. And so religious freedom actually emerges from this council as a priority for the Church to respect. And I think that that's tremendously important. And it reflects what we as Americans believe is just fundamental right, is religious freedom. And I think it's beautiful to see the Church champion it as well, even though it claims to have the one truth and claims that other religions are wrong. It still believes that religious freedom is what's morally correct. More roles and responsibilities for the lay people. So if you notice when you go to Mass today, you have a lay person is just somebody who's not a priest or a bishop, or a nun or anything like that. A lay person's just not ordained. Technically speaking, nuns and monks are lay people too, because they can't celebrate Mass. But increased role for the lay people means, you can have a reader at Mass who is, not a priest. Or you can have a Eucharistic minister, somebody who's giving out the Eucharist. If you go to Mass at Xaverian, you see that, a group of seniors is actually responsible for doing role. So giving more ways for the common guy or gal to get involved, allowing girls to be altar servers. This was a new thing. So Vatican II is, again, trying to get the common ordinary man to enter into the mystery and to take ownership of it. And so there are a huge number of dogmatic constitutions, decrees, and declarations that come out of Vatican II that set all of this up. And to wind down this video, I just want to take a closer look at the universal call to holiness, because it's something that really is the lasting message I think we all should take away from what Vatican II is and what the Church is, and how we as modern Christians are called to spread the Word of God. So, you know what? I'm going to do a separate video on this. I'm just going to do a video on the call to holiness, so you can focus on that separately. Don't forget about the quiz, and I'll see you in our next video.